All right, it's officially 11 o'clock. I have been waiting for the last 5 minutes for it to turn 11. So my name is Brandi Simonsen. I am so excited to be here with you, both for this session and for some activities throughout the conference. I am coming to you from the University of Connecticut, and my day job is that I'm a professor of special education. I also have the honor and privilege of co-directing the U.S. National Center on PBIS. And a lot of the work that I do in addition to PBIS is integrating positive behavior for learning strategies within academic supports in an MTSS framework. So in this session, although we're talking primarily about PBL, I'm going to talk to you about some of this integrated work within an MTSS or multi-tiered systems of support framework. And I do not always have huge school spirit from UConn, but you'll notice that our mascot, Jonathan the Husky, who is an actual dog, this is Jonathan 15, so there is always a living Jonathan, will show up throughout my presentations because this Jonathan has some tier 3 behavioral challenges. So I have never enjoyed a Jonathan before, but once I heard that he was struggling with behavior, he became my favorite animal on the planet. And so Jonathan 15 is occasionally being seen in public, but 14 had to come out of retirement because 15 bites people. And so I was sharing before this session, my dog is being boarded for the month that we are away traveling as a family. And so I was scrolling through the kennel's Facebook page. They're training Jonathan 15. So my dog might meet Jonathan. I hope actually not, because my dog is 6 pounds. She's a snack. But she's in the same place as Jonathan 15. So he shows up several times. But what we're actually going to chat about, what I will share is coming up on the next slide, is an acknowledgement of the team that supports this work in integrated MTSS. So the United States Department of Education funded us to do some work to show what is possible and the outcomes when we do what is possible around integrating evidence-based positive behavior for learning support strategies within academic instruction. And you all know that nothing we do in education is a solo sport. It is always a team sport. So our team is large, comprised of many educators. Mike Coyne is my colleague who does a lot of the reading research, and so I give him credit throughout the slides for the reading content. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to answer 3 basic questions during this morning's conversation. One is, why do we integrate? Why is it important to not think about academics and social, emotional, and behavioral supports as 2 distinct and separate areas of support? Why, when, how is it beneficial for us to integrate those supports? Second big question is, what do we actually mean when we talk about this? And that sounds like a really basic question, but in the US, every single state says they are implementing MTSS. There is very little consistency state to state. Even within states, there's almost no consistency district to district, and even within district, there's no consistency school to school. So our district is your region. So we all say we're doing it, but we don't define and describe what it is. So I actually think, even though we should know in this room, it's a helpful conversation to make sure we even mean the same thing. And then I want to share with you a little bit more about what we're learning about how well it works when we do it well. Okay, so I'm going to give a rationale for why, but I want you all to take 30 seconds. If you are ready to talk this morning, if you've had enough caffeine, you can chat with a partner. If you do not want to chat, you can have the internal conversation. But why do you think it's important to integrate social, emotional, and behavioral supports within academic instruction? Okay, so I did want to let you know everything that's in these slides is in a handout. Most of the figures, not all of them, but most of them are hyperlinked. So where there's a resource, you can go into the handout itself and click. I'm happy to share the slides other than the data because it's not published and it's really tentative, so it could change. So the data we're not sharing just yet. You can take pictures of it, but I won't share the slide versions of it. But everything else we're happy to share and give access to. And as soon as we're more confident in the data, we'll be sharing that broadly and loudly as well. We're just not quite confident yet. Okay, So thinking about the why, you all already had this conversation. I wanted to share a little bit of the rationale from our research network, which is the Integrated MTSS Research Network. And in that network, we have defined what integrated MTSS looks like from our perspective. I should mention, for those of you all who have been doing this work for a while, George Sugai and Rob Horner are members of our network lead. They are the founders of PBL or PBIS in the United States. So you will recognize, if you choose to click on and read this definition, a lot of the definition for PBL has made it into the definition for integrated MTSS, in part because that's where we have the strongest science. But I want to have us zoom in on this for a second. So just make a mental image of what you think about when we talk about integrating academics and behavior. And I use behavior often as a shorthand for social, emotional, behavioral, just because it's easier to say, but I always mean the full, broad view of behavior. So the old way we used to think about this is we thought about having a continuum of academic support and a continuum of social, emotional, behavioral support or behavioral support. And kind of the simplistic view, and many of our early pictures just put them together, right, into this one beautiful blended continuum. But as we started to really dive into this work, we started realizing, and probably you all figured this out long before we did, but we started realizing that that's an overly simplified picture of what it means to integrate, and especially within a whole school or even in a whole classroom, what it means to integrate. So instead, we've started thinking about how integration looks different depending on the type of need and the way we're implementing support. So there are some students who will benefit from just universal, strong, robust, differentiated, evidence-based, all of those things, but universal tier 1 support in academic and behavioral domains. So that's our core curriculum, our core PBL practices. So some kids will benefit when those practices are integrated, and they will be successful with that alone. Some students will be successful with universal academic instruction, so again, rigorous evidence-based core instruction, but they might need layered into that, not just universal PBL, but some kids might need targeted PBL supports, and a few kids are gonna need individualized or intensive tier 3 PBL supports to allow them to access and benefit from their tier 1 academic instruction. Other kids are going to do well with our universal PBL approach, but they're going to need targeted academics to access their academic content. And some kids, a few kids, are going to need really intensive academic supports to, again, access their tier 1 academic and social emotional behavioral content. And then some kids are going to need us to do a really good job of integrating targeted supports because they have targeted needs in both areas. And some kids are going to need us to do really comprehensive planning that integrates academic, behavior, and often many other domains into a truly individualized and intensive plan. And I'm guessing this is still a simplified image of what it looks like in schools because there's kids everywhere else in this continuum. But just getting us to think a little bit differently about what integration means, because I think we've often just thought about it in a pretty simplistic way, and then we ask schools to figure it out in real life. And real life is always a little more complicated. So does this image kind of match or resonate how you all have been thinking about it? Again, for some of us, this was kind of an aha moment. So the research that we are doing right now is along this diagonal. So we're looking at research on truly integrated tier 1, truly integrated tier 2, and truly integrated tier 3. And for today's session, I'm going to keep us in this bottom quadrant, but understanding how many other ways there are that we can think about integrated supports. So I just mentioned that's the research we are doing. I forgot my animation. So we had the conversation earlier about why, and you all said this already better than the slide does. But one big reason is kids don't come to us with only one set of needs. And so to think about addressing a kid's needs in separate ways probably does a disservice to them because we're not then giving them an integrated and whole experience of their interventions and supports. The data are also really clear that those needs are complementary. So when we can support students' needs on academics, we get behavioral improvements. When we support behaviors, we sometimes get academic improvements. When we support both, we get the best improvements overall. And by then linking those supports, we make it easier on educators, theoretically. That hasn't been shown quite yet, but theoretically, we make it easier on educators. And we have a quick brief that just walks through this logic, so if that's a resource that would be helpful for you to take back, you have a hyperlink to that. It just describes how instruction can be a protective factor for social, emotional, behavioral needs. I don't know if this happened here as much, but in the US, coming out of the pandemic, we saw these two really opposing camps. We saw some schools who wanted to prioritize only academics and accelerate learning and ignore some of the social, emotional, and behavioral. Or we had colleagues and friends who were saying we only should focus on social, emotional, and behavioral and ignore academics to get the kids back on track. And in reality, we should actually do both, because effective academic instruction and routines are a good social, emotional, and behavioral support. They're protective for students. And so this brief, again, just kind of goes into some of that research. So what do we know from research, and this is overly simplified, about integrated MTSS or MTSS in general? So we at this point have decades of rigorous research, some of which Kent talked about this morning, that support positive outcomes when schools implement positive behavior for learning. So we're really confident that if schools are implementing with fidelity, they will move the dial on positive outcomes for kids. They'll decrease teachers' use of exclusionary discipline. They'll improve experiences for teachers. We have mixed findings on academics, but they're promising. And our current understanding, or our best guess, is that we see academic gains when we have good academic programming in place, and PBL then allows kids to access it. When the academic programming is weak, we don't see the dial move on academics, which kind of makes sense. But right now, that's our working theory. We haven't tested it quite exactly that way. In the US, we used to call MTSS response to intervention. I think that probably trickled over. A lot of the research on response to intervention, or MTSS for academics, focuses on early reading. And so we have pretty good confidence on the outcomes for kids in early reading, but they usually don't measure behavioral outcomes. So we don't know if it improves behavior. The studies that have looked at it have kind of questionable outcomes, but really the academic research focuses only on academic outcomes. We think there are going to be really promising findings by integrating, and so that's what I'm excited to share with you, is the start of getting those findings. And my friend and colleague Steve Goodman helped develop this really simple version of the research, which is condensing lots of studies into one slide. So we think it's promising. We think it's worth exploring, both because it makes sense conceptually and research kind of points us in this direction. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what it is and what it looks like from our team's perspective. So we talk a lot about evidence-based practice. Sometimes we describe practices as high-leverage practices, those key practices that turn the dial for students to help them improve their experience and their outcomes. And if you look at the evidence-based practices, some of which, again, Kent walked through this morning, you should recognize that those are all practices we embed and emphasize in PBL. But how many of you, either currently or in the past, have taught academic content? Most of us, right? How many of those practices help us teach academic content better? It's the same practices, right? They're not new and different. It is actually the same thing that works whether we're thinking about social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes for kids or reading or math outcomes for kids. We were having a conversation last night that behavior is behavior. So reading is actually behavior. Performing math is actually behavior. So all of these practices support kids' learning and skill development across all areas. However, there is not a lot of work that's been done on how to actually embed these practices to support behavior in academic instruction. And so when we embarked on this research, we appreciated that we've been asking teachers to figure this out on their own for decades. And the researchers hadn't actually done the work to do this really well. So I don't know if you all have had this experience, but I've been training this content for almost 20 years. And I often say things like, it's really important to do good academic instruction. It'll support behavior. But you know how to do that already, so I'm going to focus on behavior. Have you all said something similar? Or my academic colleagues will teach reading and how to teach reading. And they'll say, you know, by the way, this will go better if you have good behavior support strategies in place. You know that PBL stuff. Do that. And then they keep teaching reading. So we have often left this to teachers to figure out. And we were one of the few teams that had experts in PBL and academics to really do a deep dive into what we know from each discipline. And it was eye-opening to me how different those disciplines approach things, where we have strengths in PBL that they don't have in reading, and vice versa. We have systems down, for example. The whole framework concept, that is strong on our end. Our measures for kids, like they're okay. Reading, really strong measures, but they're still figuring out the systems piece. So by thinking about building on strengths of both approaches, we can get closer to what this looks like. So I want to give you a really concrete example of what we did, because I think it'll help you see how you might bring that back and do it in the context of your lessons. I will do a slight disclaimer that in reading research, it's very common to use published evidence-based programs, which then makes them behind a paywall. So that's been really frustrating for those of us in the PBL community who want to give everything away. So the reading content, I actually can't give away because it's protected by copyright. We're putting a grant in this summer to try and develop a free access version of stuff so that we can give it away in the future. But the current version that we're using, the Enhanced Core Reading Instruction Program, is what we use. It's an evidence-based approach for reading. Have any of you heard of it? So it was developed at the University of Oregon, so a lot of the connections that we have from a good behavioral perspective come out of University of Oregon. And what it does is it layers on top of a core program. So it allows districts who have adopted or invested in an evidence-based core program, it doesn't layer on top of random things, but it does layer on top of an evidence-based core program, and it builds in structures to increase kids' ability to access the core program. So it increases the explanations, the models, it increases the opportunities for kids to be engaged, and it provides scripting for corrections. So you heard me say corrections. There's no scripting for praise. So it's a really strong evidence-based approach to enhancing core instruction that has some pretty rigorous research supporting it. And so we went with that because it allowed us to work across districts that had invested in different core programs. And then we layered in the PBL strategies. So we borrowed the Supporting and Responding to Student Social, Emotional, and Behavioral Needs document and pulled out those high leverage practices we already mentioned. So just a little more detail about ECRI. So ECRI has these very core foundational reading routines. So this is not reading across all ages, this is reading in early grades. It's the foundational skills that allow kids to then access text. And in each of those core routines, which take about 1 to 2 minutes each, so it's fast, quick instruction, there are set kind of habits or routines embedded within each of those routines. So each of them gives a brief explanation of how kids access the content. The teacher models what the kids' responses look like. The kids then practice with high rates of group and then individual opportunities to respond. And I mentioned already they script corrections. So that's what ECRI looks like standard. So the part we layered into it then, which I made teal, was the PBL strategies. So for each and every routine, we started with a behavioral prompt worked into the explanation. So reminding kids how to follow their classroom norms or expectations connected to each of those routines. And we scripted it in so teachers didn't have to think about how to prompt. And then we added example praise statements for reading and behavior. So we got teachers used to praising reading, because what we were watching even in their training videos for ECRI is teachers were praising because they wanted to be positive, but they weren't being specific with it. And so we gave them some examples of how to use their praise more effectively for reading and for behavior. And then the other piece we added is we trained teachers. In theory, these were all schools implementing PBIS or PBL, but not really. like they hadn't fully gotten it into the classrooms. So as part of our training, we asked them to create classroom matrices. And we asked them to think specifically for our study about what it looked like in whole group reading and during transitions to and from, because our study focused on whole group reading. So every time they introduced a lesson, they introduced or reminded students of the expectations. We encouraged teachers to adjust those slides. So they developed their own version of the slides for their own grade level teams. They were able to then tweak them every day. So if there were certain things they wanted to reinforce or remind from the day before, they could adjust those and have extra practice. And then we built in the teacher-student game, so where kids were earning points for desired kind of following of classroom norms or expectations during the reading routine. And at the end of the lesson, the closure was they added up their points, they saw if they met their point goal, and if they met it, they did a brief celebration, a minute or less, that helped them transition to the next activity. And if they didn't meet the goal, they did a quick reteach to set them up for success for the next time. So the whole lesson was in kindergarten closer to 20 minutes, in second grade closer to 30, but it was a brief foundational skills lesson. So the cool part was, I'm going to give you one example of what it looked like in a sound spelling routine. We got permission to actually go into the script itself. So this is a scripted program, and I'll blow a couple pieces up in a second. But I just want to highlight where there is a link picture is where we have inserted behavior content into the reading curriculum. So the teachers aren't using two things side by side. They have one script where the behavior is embedded in the context of reading. So for example, the teacher might say, you're going to practice saying sounds. When I point to a letter, say the sound in your head. When I touch under the letter, say the sound out loud as long as I touch the letter. So that's the explanation for ECRI. And then the model with the behavior prompt is, I'll show you how to say the sounds of the first two letters. Respectfully listen by waiting your turn, my turn. And so we added that because one of the common errors kids make is they want to just jump in. So we pre-corrected or prompted for the behaviors we wanted to see, which were listening. When I said this letter is say my turn, And then I would say, your turn, this letter is duh. Say duh. Your turn. Okay, I'm not the reading teacher, but. So we then embedded opportunities for specific praise or corrections depending on how students responded. So either a nice job listening respectfully by waiting your turn, or remember when it's my turn, voices are off, let's try again. So just quick redirections, not to belabor any of the points. Then the students get into their practice, and I think I just jumped into this when I was modeling. So students practice with the your turn. Again, we embedded specific praise for individual turns. And teachers are trained to do group turns and individual turns to help students who need more practice opportunities get them. So that's a place they're differentiating their instruction. The individual turns are, again, a check for understanding, but those are often provided for students who need greater opportunity. Now, you know I'm going a little fast, so you're probably not reading every word. And again, an opportunity for behavior-specific praise. So anytime the students were either expected to listen or participate, they had a chance to be recognized for that. The praise was paired with earning points in the student-teacher game. And then every routine had a closure where students were reminded how they did and whether they earned the point for that routine or not. And if not, set up to try again with the next routine. We also tried to train loosely the teacher's use of prompts, praise, and corrections for behavior. Because unlike reading, where we probably anticipate some common errors, we wanted the teachers to be responsive to the kids in front of them. So we gave them embedded examples of praise, but we also gave them a bank at the end of each routine to choose from, just to get them thinking of the way this looks. Most teachers, after they became fluent, stopped looking at the script, so it became kind of second nature to them. The schools that we worked with were in 2 large urban districts, and some of the teachers, I should mention, in this study, we randomly assigned them to either do the reading only, so they got really good training and coaching on just the reading routines, or to do the integrated reading and behavior. So they didn't choose which condition they wanted to be in, which meant that in the behavior condition, we had some teachers who were not super excited about having to do extra or different. After a couple weeks of implementing, we had teachers noticing the big difference in how their kids were engaging. And so as they started to chat with their coaches, we started to hear not just kind of the experiences of the students we were seeing in data, but the experiences of teachers really appreciating how this little bit of extra set their kids up for success. And we all know that they would be correcting the behaviors if they weren't setting the kids up for success. So it didn't take them extra time. So I'm not positive this video will work, but I'm going to try and see if we can get it to play.
Just like Candy the Tiger, we can be respectful, responsible, and safe. We can be respectful. We are respectful when we wait for the teacher's signal before responding. We are respectful when we allow think time to our classmates, and we are respectful when we keep our eyes on the person speaking. We can be responsible. We are responsible when we use materials appropriately and put them back where they belong. We are responsible when we read each time we are supposed to be reading, and we are responsible when we follow directions. We can be safe. We are safe when we stay within our personal space on the rug. We are safe when we use walking feet, and we are safe when we keep our hands and feet to ourselves. It's fun to be respectful, responsible, and safe. Today's goal, as always, is 10 points, and when we earn 10 points, we can choose from any one of these 4 choices here. Are we ready? Yes. All right. You're going to practice reading words using say it, spell it, say it. Respectfully listen by waiting for your turn. When it's your turn and I give the signal, everyone says and spells the word together. My turn. Word. Together. Your turn. Word.
Together.
Spell.
Together.
Word. My turn.
So I want to think about how we can make these lessons generalizable across content, across grades, and across student levels of need. So one small step we've taken is we are one team, and we are the lead group for this research network. We are joined by teams from Kansas, from Texas, and from Washington, D.C. And so we put together a special issue that's going to become open access. Right now it's still behind a paywall because there's paperwork, but it's going to live on mtss.org. And each article has a focus on how to integrate Tier 1, which is the paper I'm highlighting right now. There's one on integrated Tier 2, where they built in some self-regulation strategies within the content of reading and math instruction. There is one conceptual one that we wrote on Tier 3. We're still working to finish that study, so it's not research-based yet. There's one on how to integrate professional learning by Kathleen Lane and her team at Kansas and across other universities as well. And then there's one from a group who developed a new fidelity rubric for integrated MTSS, the Integrated MTSS Fidelity Rubric that they awkwardly call the IMFR. So the IMFR is the first tool that assesses integration, not just fidelity. So it layers on top of a TFI, for example, to say you're doing PBL with fidelity, but how well are you integrating across behavior, reading, math, or whatever contents areas are taught. So each of those articles will become free access on mtss.org, hopefully within the next month, but for sure this summer at some point. So just bookmark that page because those will be available. And in this, we created a generic lesson plan that would help teachers integrate in the way that we did in the ECRI with any content, we hope. We haven't tested it yet, but we hope. So I started to spoil my landing place, which is the data. And I already cautioned this is the part that we won't share yet. So in this study, I mentioned we randomly assigned teachers and then their classrooms to either implement this rigorous reading program or the behavior component integrated within this rigorous reading program. So at the start of the school year, all of the teachers received training in ECRI. They were then coached monthly, at least once, if not twice, on fidelity, high fidelity use of ECRI. around November, so our school year starts end of August, around November, they then participated in one of 2 training series. So in one training series, they kept getting support on science of reading, but more conceptual, because we didn't want to advantage them over the other group in having deeper practice with ECRI only. The integrated group got introduced a new script that had the integrated practices. They were asked to create their slides. They were asked to start implementing integrated. So from November through the end of the school year, we followed teachers. We've now done this across 2 cohorts of teachers. So the first cohort that I'm sharing data with you from, I think, is roughly 88 classrooms. We had another set of closer to 100 classrooms this year that we just finished. So we've not even gotten close to looking at their data yet. And so the questions we were interested in is, does it work? And we had all of these conversations about what do we even mean by that? Like, does it mean that it worked if the reading stayed the same but the behavior improved? Does it only work if we improved reading and behavior? And so where we came to was thinking, part of what we're showing is that we can meet 2 areas of need in the same amount of time. So even if we didn't get a reading change, but we got a behavior change, we'd be really excited. So I think I've done all the disclaimers I need to do. Cohort 1, not fully analyzed. We're not fully trusting these data yet, all of those things. So very preliminary. But the first question we wanted to know was what happens to teachers' implementation fidelity of the program? And so on the left-hand panel are the reading fidelity scores. And so this was assessed by observers going in and watching teachers teach at several points during the year. And they were tracking each and every component of those routines. So did the teacher explain? Did they model? Did they do individual responses? So every single item in that was checked. And I'm mentioning that because hitting 100% on all of them would be near impossible for a normal human. So the fidelity scores are slightly lower because our tool was so hard. But then we separated out the behavior components. So teachers who are represented in the gray bar are those that were assigned to ECRI only, our reading only condition. The teal bar in this graph and for all of the graphs is the integrated condition. So as you're looking at those data, and you remember that I mentioned one of the biggest pushbacks that I got was that we were going to break reading, that I was putting too much behavior content, or we were putting too much behavior content into the reading content. Just if you had to say which group won in terms of reading fidelity implementation, it was the behavior group. And so what was really exciting, I think, personally, and hopefully for the field, is that we actually saw a better implementation of the reading program when the teachers were implementing it in an integrated way. So not just the behavior components, but the reading components themselves were implemented with greater fidelity. And for the research geeks, the effect sizes are included in the graphs where they exist. And those are pretty substantial effect sizes, right? The difference between groups was pretty large for reading only, and we expected it to be big for behavior because we were emphasizing behavior. It was interesting to me, though, and I don't know if you have heard this piece, but I had a colleague in the past who used to tell me that we didn't need to do PBIS if we just did instruction really well. So there's a very working theory among academic folks that their instruction, if done well, should take care of all the behavioral needs of students, because instruction is all the kids need. And so seeing the difference in what behavior implementation looked like for the teachers who weren't focused on it helped kind of push back on teachers don't just naturally do this if they're teaching content. Like, it's not enough to just focus on teaching reading. So I think I already made this point, but it really drove home, again, preliminary, we could see it change, but in this data set, it looks like teaching in an integrated way made the reading instruction better. Are we all excited? Okay, good, because I'm super excited. All right, next thing we looked at was differences in teachers' practice. So these data are kind of summarized across all teachers in those conditions, and then we did multiple observations at each time point, so it's summarized across teachers and across observations within each time point. So there were several observations during the pre-phase when all teachers were implementing reading only. We then because I'm a behavior person, wanted to check in the middle because I didn't want to wait till the end of the study to find out teachers weren't doing things. So we have a midpoint phase that we might not use in our analysis, but I think is really helpful and interesting. And then the post-data collection was in late April through late May. And our school year ends in these districts usually in mid-June. So we were up to like 2 weeks before school ended with our post-data collection, when at least in the States, some teachers choose to stop teaching content. Like my kids started watching movies in June. So we were really emphasizing to these teachers that it's critical content, we need you to keep teaching, and they did, which was fantastic. So the prompt differences is the extent to which teachers used behavioral prompts ahead of time as they were scripted, and not a huge surprise that there was a difference between those doing behavior and those doing just reading only. Their opportunities to respond were not significantly different, but the behavior condition had slightly fewer, so the reading condition won. But just in case you can't see the numbers from the back, in the reading condition, we were seeing 8 opportunities to respond a minute. So I mentioned in the masterclass yesterday, I'd heard those rates. I thought they were like unicorns that didn't really exist. But we saw them in this study. So 8 opportunities to respond a minute, and integrated it was 7.65. So it's still crazy high rates of opportunities to respond. Like again, they're unicorn rates from everything I had seen in all of my work up until this study. So that was one of my takeaways, was how impactful it is to have really rigorous instruction that's scripted, because I've worked with teachers on increasing OTRs, and I have never seen this other than one classroom I mentioned yesterday where the teacher started with that rate. But other than her and this study, it's not something we see usually in real life. My academic colleague was like, oh yeah, we see that. It's like, right, sure you do, because you never count it, so you don't know. But we counted it. Here's specific praise. Specific corrections, which you would expect to be in both groups because they were scripted into the reading only. General praise, it was actually desired that the integrated condition had less general because we wanted them to use more specific. And general negatives, which were not desired for anybody, were lower for integrated. So for 3 of these, the effect sizes were pretty sizable. And for my academic colleagues who never see effect sizes this big, they were like eye-popping for them. It's like, this is what we do in behavior. We see big changes, but they were really excited. So we've talked about what the teachers are doing. Then we took data on how this worked for kids. So we took data in a couple of ways. I mentioned already, and obviously from this, we were in there counting teachers' practices so we could get rates of how often teachers were doing each practice. For students, we took some data on rating scales, which is what I'm about to show you next. How many of you have looked at rating scale changes over time for kids? Some, maybe not many. They're really hard to move because rating scales measure teachers' perceptions of children, which don't always change as fast as kids' behavior. So while those are often kind of more normative measures, and my academic colleagues really like normative measures, I pushed, and we did, do direct observations. So we had this really rigorous protocol that we thought was never gonna happen, but we actually pulled off, where in each of these classrooms, in the same observation that we were counting teachers' behavior, we whipped around the class and grabbed student behavior. So we also tracked that at the kid level. So this is very preliminary data that I'm about to share with you, but we know which kids had which levels of behavior, and we know their demographics. So we're gonna be able to, with this data set, look at who benefited the most from different racial and ethnic groups, from different disability classifications, from different language statuses. So we haven't done that yet. The rating scale data show change. That never happens, at least in our studies. They're slow to change. They're not huge changes, but they were all statistically significant changes in kids' rated behavior. And the DESA, the first graph in the top left, is a strengths-based screener that our state in Connecticut has started using. And so we were really excited to see movement on the DESA. Even though the change is small, it still showed up as statistically significant because there were so many students involved. And then kids were more engaged and less off task. So now that we're 2 minutes over, quick recap. We talked about why, what, and does it work. I'm happy to chat longer because clearly I get excited about this stuff. But I will also invite you, please send me emails if you have other questions or come up and chat. I will not check email until after July 15th, so do not expect a quick response, but I will be very quick after that. Thank you all for hanging out with me for an extra 2 minutes, and I will see you all tomorrow morning.